Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the weekly MMA Cycles Market Update. This is Gianni DePoci, your host, and I'm joined this week by the one, the only Pouyan Zolfagharnia, MMA analyst and MMTA graduate. Pouyan, how are you today?
I'm well, thank you, Gianni. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's always great to have you on, and I can't stress enough the timing of this meeting between you and I because a lot of big moves in markets. Obviously, gold and silver have been doing very well. Stocks are on the defensive here. We'll look at that in a moment. But Bitcoin and Ethereum absolutely exploding to the upside. So we'll get to that all in a moment. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. We will start off by looking at the Dow Jones, seeing some major distribution here today on Wednesday. We are almost back at the week's lows. We talked about the primary cycle turning bearish, possible longer term cycles culminating in stocks. So Pouyan, what's your take on what's going on in the equity space and how concerned should traders and investors be in the near term?
I completely agree with your outlook. I think the cycles have turned bearish as well. And I think that momentum will continue into the end of the year, potentially the beginning of next year, around January, when the primary cycles are due. So I think you've been calling that in your reports as well, and it's been playing out as anticipated. Once I think we also had Ray discussed the fact that the equity markets were going to be trading within the prior year's bounds in terms of the highs and the lows, and that seems to have worked out exactly as he predicted. We had the markets reach their crest in the summer, just as Venus was turning retrograde. I found that when we get these Venus retrogrades in Leo, and we've had a couple of them. So I think the last one was in 2015, and there was one in 2007 as well. The Venus retrogrades in Leo tend to correspond to intermediate, if not long-term crests forming in the equity markets. So and that was interesting to see as well, and it has been playing out in that way.
Very good. Let's jump over to the NASDAQ because technology is suffering here today as well. The cash market just broke to its lowest level since late May. So it's definitely on the defensive here. And, what are some of your targets for the NASDAQ? How low do you think it can go?
I think I can't remember it at the top of my head, but I think we're about halfway through the cycle. So I think it will go lower than where we are.
Yeah.
I think we're seeing we've seen the first major cycle trough form, and then we're making another move down. So we're going for the second major cycle. So I think we'll get a pullback and a rebound upwards before the final sell-off takes place towards the end of the year. So I haven't got the targets right in front of me at the moment, but I think they are due to go lower than where we are right now.
Well, I will say, on the NASDAQ for me, I'm kind of we're looking at the cash market here, but for the futures, I'm kind of eyeballing the 13,400, give or take a couple $100 on each side, perhaps. So that'd be like another, 7 to 10% lower from current levels. And, interestingly, as we look at these cycles, we're coming up into Sun conjunct Mars in November, which I know was a big aspect for Ray to keep in mind for now. At the end of this week, we are going to enter another reversal period. We started off this geocosmic cluster with the Sun squaring Pluto last Saturday. Then we had Venus trine Jupiter. And then earlier this week, yesterday, was Sun trine Saturn. And then on Saturday, the same day as the lunar eclipse, we'll have Mars in opposition to Jupiter. So, I know you want to talk about some mundane stuff, Pouyan, and I think I'm going to pull up gold because we've seen it do well in this market. But why don't you speak to some of the mundane aspects that you were talking about? Because gold continues to be very resilient in this market, despite the strength in the dollar. So that's a pretty profound shift, in my opinion, from a macroeconomic standpoint. So, Pouyan, share a little bit about the mundane stuff and the eclipse observation you made.
Sure. So we knew gold was forming a intermediate 50-week cycle, and it was within the range, or within our buying range. We just didn't know what was going to cause gold to rally. When we were looking at the dollar rallying at the time, it didn't seem to make sense. The fact that the equity markets were on the weak side helped, but again, you had the treasuries reaching about 5% yield. So we're thinking that's going to be really bad for gold. What's going to cause this rally? And when we were having our internal meetings, and lo and behold, on the 7th of October, you had the Hamas attacks on Israel, and we saw the safe haven trade really take off in gold. And I think from a mundane point of view, we had a solar eclipse on the 25th of October, 2022, so last year, and those eclipse points remain charged until one of the other planets transits that point, and it's usually with Mars and Saturn, you get big events happening when they transit eclipse points, and especially Mars, because it has a lot of energy, and Martian energy to do with tension and attacks, and that seemed to take place about a week before Mars' exact transit. So that was really interesting to observe. And the other interesting observation was on the same day, we had another solar eclipse on the 14th of October. And we're still, as that eclipse plays out, so you've got the solar eclipse and you've got the lunar eclipse 2 weeks later. So I think we're about 2 or 3 days away from the lunar eclipse.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the location where that solar eclipse took place, it was over Central America, all the way from Mexico down to Costa Rica. And what we're seeing right now, as the lunar eclipse is about to take place, you've got a big hurricane coming and approaching that same landmass. So it's interesting how the solar eclipse paths can sometimes help you locate where events might manifest on a mundane point of view as well.
Indeed. And it's really interesting. Let's jump over to crude oil. We'll use USO as a proxy. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on crude oil, and if you would prefer to look at the spot price, we can. We just won't have today's price section. But still a bit of a conundrum in the primary cycle, I think. But you would think that the geopolitical situation would lend itself to higher energy prices. I still think Saturn and Pisces, global energy shortages are driving the fundamental backdrop of crude oil right now. But what's your take on what's going on in energy at the moment?
I completely agree with you. So looking at the bigger picture, the longer cycles, as you mentioned, you've got Saturn entering the sign for crude oil, which is Pisces. I think that transit took place in March. And when it was happening, and when we were discussing it last year, we weren't quite sure whether the Saturn dampening effect was going to work on demand or supply for crude oil. So we weren't sure exactly which way prices were going to go. But looking at the fundamentals, especially right now, the market's really tight.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Saturn relates to contractions, rules, limitations, and what you've got right now is Saudi Arabia. I think since June they've increased their crude oil cuts, so that started to boost prices. Russia has done the same, and they extended that. They were only going to do it for a couple of months, and they extended it until the end of the year. So there's a shortage of supply right now in the market. At the same time, you've got geopolitical tension, and I think that geopolitical tension, from a mundane perspective, looking at astrology, is only going to build. I don't think what's happening
going into the aspects in November. I mean, we're not out of the thick of it yet.
No, exactly, and that's why looking at the primary cycle and this sudden pullback we've had this week, I believe it's going to be short-lived. Again, looking at the long-term chart and where we are, given the fact that a lot of the oil reserves are really low as well at the moment. So all of that to me means I believe we're going to hit new all-time highs in crude oil. It might not happen in this current primary cycle, but in this intermediate cycle, that's where my targets are.
Yeah, well, interestingly, we periodically bring up the study of, Uranus going through signs and, the boom bust cycle associated with that. And, as much as energy prices have risen in the last couple of years, we still haven't taken out the all-time high from 2008, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. And it took the NASDAQ after, Uranus went through Aquarius, it took the NASDAQ about 15 years to recover and make its new all-time high. And here we are now, Pouyan, 15 years later from the all-time high in 2008
Exactly.
crude oil. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, especially when it comes to geocosmics. So yeah, I'm with you. I think we could see a new all-time high in energy. And if anything is going to create a recession, especially in the United States, it would have to be high energy prices because, as they say, you never bet against the American consumer because they'll spend until they'll spend money they don't have. They'll spend until they can't borrow anymore. But let's jump over to the big movers of the week, Pouyan. Bitcoin and Ethereum. I mean, what a move! Bitcoin exploding to a new all-time high. I think that vindicates the primary cycle labeling from here on September 11th. But I mean, just absolutely explosive move. And I think that we're getting in the late stages of the 15-month cycle, which is the first phase to the 4-year cycle in Bitcoin. So I don't think this is really a move to be chasing at this point from a risk-reward standpoint. I would like to see prices go sideways. I think we could at least hit 39 to 40,000 within the current primary cycle. But that's how I see crypto right now. What is your take on it, and anything you're looking at geocosmically with this?
It's interesting. The past 2 primary cycles we've had for Bitcoin, they haven't suddenly just exploded off their primary bottom. They seem to linger around for about 5-6 weeks, and then it's on that sixth or seventh week where they suddenly explode. And we saw that last year. I think the primary cycle started, and the long-term cycle, 4-year cycle, started in November, but it wasn't until January when we suddenly saw Bitcoin explode upwards. And in terms of the price targets you just gave, I agree. I think we're going to meet some resistance around that 40,000 mark, and that's within the current primary cycle. So we're nearly there. And then we've got that intermediate cycle, the 15-month cycles. We need to get a correction. It seems to be in time for the fact that every 4 years, Bitcoin, I forget the term they use, where the halving, where the miner is essentially what they can get from it will have. So every time the halving takes place, you do tend to get small pullback, and then once halving takes place, it's after that where you get another big rally. I would say almost like an intermediate term to long-term rally taking place after halvings. So that's due to take place. Is it around April of next year, the halving?
It's in the first quarter. It's in the first quarter. I don't think it's April. I think it's before April.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and I was thinking, well, what's definitely happening around April is we got the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction taking place. So that would be a perfect time for it to start rallying in the sign of Taurus. So that's one thing to eye up. But I agree. In terms of the current primary cycle, I would also advise some caution once we get close to 40,000, and would like to see some sort of pullback taking place, the market just correcting and resting a little bit, which I guess that would be to the first quarter of 2024.
Let's jump over to Ethereum real quick, because it's really amazing the trading signals that we had, with respect to intermediate term cycles and divergences and whatnot. So when we were looking at the last chart, you may have noticed that Bitcoin never took out its low from June 15th of this year, whereas Ethereum did. Now, Ethereum's 4-year cycle bottomed in June of last year, and we dropped to make a new low here in October. And, Pouyan, I think this was a 15-month cycle low in Ethereum. So I think Ethereum's a little further ahead in its longer term cycle than Bitcoin, which gives it perhaps some more upside potential in the coming weeks compared to Bitcoin, because as you said, we're close to our price objectives. But if Ethereum's in a new 15-month cycle, that should be more bullish for it, should it not?
Yeah, I completely agree. And if you compare it to where we are with Bitcoin, it's got a lot more room left to grow. Bitcoin is already taking out the crest of the previous primary cycle, whereas Ethereum hasn't. So that would make sense, and it would follow the pattern we see in terms of you tend to see Bitcoin lead the way early on in the cycles, and then you get Ethereum and some other altcoins follow on afterwards. So it would follow that mentality. The only thing I'm not sure about it. So right now there's a lot of rumors around the Bitcoin spot ETF, and that's kind of a lot of people are pointing to that for the main driver behind Bitcoin rallying. I don't think anyone's doing the Ethereum spot ETF yet, so
no,
I'm not sure.
They might be trying,
what may end up driving Ethereum, but ultimately, I think that there are some of the big fundamental factors that are happening apart from the Bitcoin ETF. Right now, you got the equity markets falling, and at the same time, especially in China, where there's a lot of active participants in this market, you've actually got the whole housing market there in trouble, and the government has been injecting a lot of cash into the economy. I think the Chinese central bank has injected something like 100 billion into the economy. And every time you see them do that, every time you see a lot of liquidity suddenly being injected by governments, you do tend to see rallies in one of the markets. So the money has to go and flow somewhere.
Sure.
And it seems to be correlating to this big move we've had in Bitcoins. And I think, as you said, you got Ethereum that will then follow on from that momentum.
Well, I will say this from a geocosmic standpoint, when I'm watching with respect to Ethereum, is on the 8th of November, Venus goes into Libra, and that transit has been shown to have a high probability of 20% or greater moves in Ethereum specifically. For Bitcoin, it's actually Venus and Taurus, but I think that's a really beautiful correlation. Bitcoin is ruled by Taurus, Ethereum is ruled by Libra per the studies, and you see higher probabilities of 20% or greater moves. So we're only 2 weeks away from that. And, as you pointed out, we're a little earlier in the cycle here for Ethereum. So that could be around the time where we see the big move, for Ethereum. But Pouyan, that's all the time that we had to cover markets today. Tell us about your ETF report. When is that going to be published next? Not the ETF, excuse me. That's my report. Your report is the monthly addendum report.
And it's on Monday. It's coming out this Monday.
Okay.
I think I'm also doing the monthly reports with yourself and the weeklies. So I think the next big one to come out will be on Monday.
Okay. Very good. Well, thank you everyone for watching. Pouyan, thank you as always for joining. You can find all of Pouyan's work, MMA's work at www.mmacycles.com. We'll be back same time, same place next week. Enjoy the rest of the week, everyone. Take care.